Welcome everybody to yet another event by the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. This lecture by Bill Tabb and Fred Magdoff is being co-sponsored by a number of organizations. They're up here on the wall, is on the blackboard as well. And we invite any of the groups that have co-sponsored this event to share with us at the end, I think the end of the lecture, any events that are going on that you'd like us to know about. I know some students did a great action on campus last weekend, got some good media press, and I don't know whether anybody from that group is here. Yes? You might want to mention a little bit about what your work is on campus. In fact, you want to come down right now? You sure? Come real quick and tell us about what you guys did. This is the kind of thing that Will would have really appreciated and was very proud of you students for working on this issue. So go ahead, because some people might not know what I'm talking about. Thanks.
Hi, I'm with the Students Against War. We're part of the Campus Anti-War Network. And this past Friday, we had a rally on the steps of Waterman. Nearly 200 people, actually over 200 people came and then marched into the presidential wing of Waterman, kind of took it over briefly, then kind of marched back out, against UVM's involvement in UVM has invested in a number of war profiteers and military contractors, including Halliburton, General Dynamics, and Dynacorp. And the rally was against our school's involvement in the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was a huge success, and the campaign continues.
Thank you. So just to make clear of the other groups that have helped sponsor this event, University Departments of English and Economics have both supported this event. American Friends Service Committee, Global Justice Ecology Project, Green Mountain Forum, International Socialist Organization, Peace and Justice Center, Toward Freedom, the Will Miller Green Mountain Vets for Peace, Vermont Workers Center, and the Champlain Valley Labor Council, along with Students for Peace and Global Justice. So thank you, all of you, for helping out. So I'm going to share with you, because some of you may not know why we have this lecture series. I'm just going to share with you what the goals of this lecture series are. The Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series brings speakers to the Burlington community and the University of Vermont campus to provide a radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. The series is dedicated to Will Miller, Vermont's activist philosopher and UVM philosophy professor for 35 years. Will set a courageous example in speaking truth to power. He showed boundless optimism and a passion for the truth. His voice was powerful, especially in encouraging others, students, staff, faculty, community members, and people from around the world to speak up and be heard. Always vigilant, his personal strength and an unwavering commitment to the struggle against war and for social justice, he helped to move others to activism. He was never afraid to speak his mind, put words into action, or place himself on the line, whether before the university trustees, on a picket line, at a barricade, or in a congressional office. Will offered reasoned and insightful analyses into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us a call to struggle and a vision of a more just society. He advocated for a society where all work is valued, where truth is not silenced, but is nurtured, where all are treated as equals, that is at peace with itself, and where people and resources are not exploited. The lecture series will sponsor events that are connected to social, ecological, and political concerns, that will assist the community in understanding the origins, workings, and implications of capitalism and imperialism, that will encourage active participation in the creation of a more just society and are accessible to all. had one more thing to say, and I just forgot it. Senior moments. If I think of it, I'll get back up and say it. Ann, do you want to go next? Ann is another one of our board members. In fact, if we could just recognize all of the board members.
Yeah.
Fred Magdoff, one of the speakers tonight. Oh, and I just thought of what I wanted to say. Ann Peterman, help me out. Mike Cassidy, up in the back. Helen Scott, in the back also, and Colin Robinson. The one other thing that I wanted to mention was our two guest speakers are connected to Monthly Review. They're both on the board of directors there of the magazine. No, okay, whatever. Connected to Monthly Review. Will had the opportunity to write an article which got published in Monthly Review, and he was very proud of that accomplishment. Interestingly enough, one of the people who was in that same magazine, that issue of the magazine, was Michael Parenti, the person who actually was supposed to do our inaugural address but couldn't come due to illness. And the top billed author was Bill Tabb. And I don't know whether you realized that you actually were in that same issue. And the articles that are in that, I've just been rereading them this past month. And the articles that were, I think they're 5 or 6 years old now, are still excellent. And it was wonderful to sort of get to know your writing by reading that. So anyway, there's a connection. So go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for braving such a very nasty night out there. It's supposed to be turning into snow and slush and sleet and hail. And anyway, thanks for coming. I'm here to give the fundraising pitch. That's my role. I'm the person who does all the fundraising for my own organization, Global Justice Ecology Project, and so I enjoy giving the fundraising pitches for the Will Miller Lecture Series. And it's very important that we have individual contributions. They're the only source of income for the lecture series, aside from the t-shirts and the books that we sell. So we very much appreciate when the can comes your way to please be generous with it, and be sure to sign up on the sign-up sheets that are going around so that we can give you information about future events. We try to do these events at least twice a year, one in the fall and one in the spring. In fact, we've already identified our spring speaker, and of course I didn't write it down, so I can't remember her name. What's the name of our spring speaker? Leading Afghanistan. She's with the Revolutionary Afghani Women's Association, and she wrote Bleeding Afghanistan, and she's going to be talking about the impacts of the war in Afghanistan on women, particularly in Afghanistan, and the incredible humanitarian crisis that's been caused there. Some people like to think of Afghanistan as the good Middle Eastern war, and she will be talking about how it is, in fact, anything but. It's another tragedy caused by this imperialist government. So anyway, please be generous when the can comes your way. Please sign up on the sign-up sheets. Your contributions are what make these events possible, and we very much appreciate them. And thank you very much for your generosity and for coming to this event tonight. Thank you.
I was going to introduce myself and Bill. My name is Fred Magdoff. I'm a professor emeritus of plant and soil science. I've had many interests outside of the science of plant and soil science, including the American economy and the world food crisis, which is related to both of those, actually, and food in general, larger issues than just the growing of it. Bill Tabb, I'm going to speak first, maybe about 20 minutes or so. If I go too much longer, somebody should go like this, okay? Just remember that. and I was going to try to give some of the background with some data, and then we'll shut off the PowerPoint, and then Bill will speak. Bill Tabb is a professor emeritus of Queens College. He's written numerous books, many articles, a monthly review, and other places. One of his books, The Amoral Elephant, is upstairs on one of the display tables up there. I'm sure if you get a copy that Bill will be happy to inscribe it. Is that true? But of course. Let me just dim some of the front lights here for this purpose, and then we'll turn it back up, and I'll kill this light too. This is an exchange that took place last Thursday, okay? This is Representative Waxman in Congress. In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working. This is Greenspan's answer, the former Secretary of the Federal Reserve. Chairman, the Federal Reserve. Precisely. That's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I had been going for 40 years or more with a very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well. I still do not fully understand why it happened. And I would say that one of the reasons that he didn't understand what was going on with the American economy was that he hadn't been reading Monthly Review. And let me just read you something from Monthly Review, written by Harry Magdoff, my father, and Paul Sweezy, the longtime co-editors of the magazine, in 1988. But you may ask, won't the powers that be step into the breach again and abort the crisis before it gets a chance to run its course? Yes, certainly. That by now is standard operating procedure, and it cannot be excluded that it will succeed in the same ambiguous sense that it did after the 1987 stock market crash. This was written in 1988. If so, we will have the whole process to go through again on a more elevated and more precarious level. But sooner or later, next time or further down the road, it will not succeed. We will then be in a new situation as unprecedented as the conditions from which it will have emerged. And that is the condition we're at. And some of the data and some of the approach that I'm going to show you is really Harry's and Paul's thesis, if you will, and the data behind the thesis as to the background to the current crisis, which Bill will be talking about the crisis itself, and I'm talking about really just the background to it. Essentially, the background is really that mature capitalism does not grow very rapidly. It really doesn't grow anywhere near as rapidly as it is theoretically able to grow. So it is stagnant, unless there is something that spikes it, and I'll show you some examples of that. That means it's very hard to make a profit the old-fashioned way, that is, actually making something and a good of some sort and selling it to somebody, or providing a service and selling that service to them like a barber shop or something like that, okay? Yeah, so it became increasingly difficult to make money in this fashion. And so what happened was, really starting in the 1980s, and you'll see this, investment in the American economy, and this is reflected also globally in Europe as well, turns away from what economists call, I don't call it this, the real economy, towards the financial sector, which obviously must be the unreal economy if that's in, distinction to the real economy. At the same time, starting with the Reagan era, began really what can only be looked at as a war against working people in the United States and the social programs that supported them. And that especially is a war on unions, which Reagan started with the destruction of the PATCO strikers, the air traffic controllers. So what does this lead to then? This leads to a period, a long period, and I'll show you some of the data so you can see what's behind. This, what I'm showing you now is sort of like the theory in a nutshell. Stagnant wages, growth of inequality, the increase in the financial system out of all proportion to the real economy. So the financial system just explodes because that is the place to make money. Enormous increase in debt and speculation. There's an article on that if you're interested in one of the monthly reviews that's on sale from 2 years ago. And a potential economic tsunami, tsunami is the word that Greenspan used to describe what he sees happening. So these are the things that have been happening. And I'd like to just show you some of the examples with some real data. This is the growth of the gross domestic product, or the growth of the economy from the 1930s to the present. And I did have a pointer to point at that thing, but I can't. Oh, here it is. Damn it. Okay, turn it on. You can see that in the 1930s, obviously, it was the Depression. The economy was growing very slowly. World War II really dominated the 1940s, and you had relatively rapid growth in the U.S. economy, close to 6% a year in real GDP. That's after correcting for inflation. And then you can see what happens in the 50s. Not bad, 4.1, the 60s, 4.4. And then you start to get in the 70s a fall off, 3.3, 3.1, 3.1. And from 2000 to 2007, 2.6. This is the stimulation of the war. This is the stimulation of the post-war economy, which was dominated by automobiles, the suburbanization, everything that went along with that, including the building of the interstate transportation system, the interstate highway system, et cetera. So the economy is growing relatively slowly, and that is the stagnation part. If you look at where the profits have been generated in the economy, you can see that manufacturing, which used to generate 50% of the profits, this is back now in the 60s, now generates about 12% of the profits of all the companies in the United States, domestic profits. The financial companies, which were down around 15% or so, are now generating about 40% of all of the profits in the U.S. economy. So the financial system has just grown. We still have plenty of manufacturing going on, but it has lessened as a percentage of the economy. Well, part of the financial business, or the tremendous increase in the financial system, has been in the creation of debt. Debt by households, and I'll show you this separately, debt that's held by financial systems, companies, debt that's held by other businesses, by the government, et cetera. And this is what, if you look at the gross, whoops, geez, this thing's, holy smokes, this has gotta be very careful. You can see that GDP, that is the economy, is growing like this. This is in trillions of dollars, and see what's happening with debt. And you can see that it starts in the early to mid 80s. Almost everything you look at with regard to the United States economy starts to change around that period. The dynamics change around that period. And then if you look at the amount of debt, of all the debt, household, business, and government, as a percent of the economy, it was about 150% back in the 70s. It's now 350%. This is 2007 data. And if you include the debt that's held by the federal government in the agencies, it's actually 373%. That's that little square up there. The line is really debt held by private entities, if you will. They call it the public, but it's really private entities. Okay, so you've had this tremendous increase in debt. You've had just out of any relationship to the growth of the economy. What's happened to workers' wages? This is in constant dollars using 1982 dollars. So this is corrected for inflation. And if anybody can see any trend there, you're a lot better than I am. Essentially, it stays pretty much the same. It goes up a little bit, it comes down, it goes up again. but essentially the 2006 average wage in the United States was around where it was in the late 1960s. So wages have been stagnant. On the other hand, the 400 richest Americans have a net worth of $1.6 trillion, more than the wealth of the bottom 150 million people. That's 400, okay? The richest 1% of the households in the United States take home 25% of the actual income in the United States and control close to a third of the wealth in the United States. Gives you some idea of the inequality. This is the amount of salaries and wages as a percentage of the economy, of the GDP. And you can see it's, you can see it's been going down. It was up in the 50s, and now it's down in the mid-40s. This is what goes to workers in wages and salaries as a percentage of the whole economy. So that's been going down. On the other hand, I think you're all aware that personal consumption has been going up. So this is consumption, as again, as a percentage of the economy, has gone up. Again, you can see the change in the early to mid-'80s, and it's gone up and up and up till it's around 70% of the total economy. Wages are stagnant, you have this tremendous growth of inequality, and you have this increase in spending by people. So the question is, how in the world can that happen? Well, one thing is that you have a lot more two-earner households than you used to have, so that helps to support the family. People are working longer hours, and many are taking on extra jobs or part-time jobs in order to make ends meet. And they're saving less, and they're going more into debt. Credit card debt, using their houses as ATM machines up until recently, etc. So this is household debt as a percent of the economy. It was, don't want to show you that yet. It was about half of the GDP, and now the total debt that's owed by households is 100% in 2007 of the underlying economy on an annual basis. So debt is increasing not just as numerically, but as its importance to the economy. Don't forget, total debt in the whole economy is 350% of the gross domestic product. But look what's happened to financial debt. So these financial institutions not only create debt, but they take on debt in order to make bets, which they're calling that's called leverage. In other words, they borrow money in order to make bets on something, to make investments, so-called, that are really bets. And you can see that that has just skyrocketed, the amount of debt held by these financial companies. That they owe, excuse me. So what has resulted then, so you've got this accumulation of debt in every sector of the society that has been keeping the economy going. The financial system has made that able to happen, and in the process, they have basically created a huge casino in which you can gamble on just about anything. Many of these are called financial instruments. This is the next to the last slide, by the way. Many of these are called financial instruments, but they're really better called, and the CEO of this large corporation that is now getting $100 billion from the government, is 100 million AIG is getting? 100 million from the government, 125, whatever it is. Call them financial products. They create new products to sell to people. So what are these products? Well, they can be anything. You can bet literally on anything. You have credit CDOs, you have credit default swaps, which are in the $50 to $60 trillion ranges. Anybody see 60 Minutes on Sunday? The first segment, if you haven't seen it, go and see it online. The first segment is on these credit default swaps and what they are and what they aren't. And they're essentially bets on anything you want to bet on. And they create these so-called instruments that allow you to bet on the price of anything, literally. There are derivatives, Hedge funds, there's $2 trillion in hedge funds. There are people now dying to get out of these hedge funds and selling off. There's the carry trade, which is just about ended, where people were borrowing money, mainly in Japan, the Japanese yen, because the interest rates were so low, and taking it to other countries where interest rates were higher, and so they could invest that money and make money. So the whole idea with the financial industry is you make money with money. You don't make a product or a service and sell it to people. You eliminate that intermediary, and money makes money. Everybody with me on that? Okay, and leveraging we talked about, it can be as little as 3 to 1. It can be as high as 20, 30, 40, 50 to 1 that they borrow of other people's money to make bets. These are the financial corporations. You can bet on anything. You can bet on the difference, I just found out relatively recently, the difference in the price of wheat between Kansas City and Chicago. One person lost $6 billion for a company called Amaranth 2 years ago by betting on the direction of change between natural gas prices in March and April of 2007. He wasn't buying any gas. He wasn't buying any right to the gas. He was making a bet on how big the spread would be and what direction it would go in between these 2 months. Okay? So you can bet on anything. You can create any type of gambling that you'd like to. This just shows you the growth of the credit default swaps that started in 2000 as explained. These were illegal. This was considered to be gambling in almost every state. And so the financial firms got Congress with President Clinton's signature to approve essentially legalizing what was illegal, which had been made illegal in 1907, and made these types of bets legal. So you can see what happened. They are a huge part of the current problem that we're facing. So Greenspan is in a state of shocked disbelief to find out what? Well, the rest of these aren't his words, but to find out that there's gambling going on in the casino which he helped to create. And we don't want to give him too much credit because the financial companies, Congress, the President of the United States were all involved in this, and the financial companies pushing for it. But it was clear what was happening. If you want to read from 2 years ago, the article in Monthly Review about the explosion of debt and speculation, one of the monthly reviews that's up in the back has that topic. Okay, let me end with a quote from our president. And this is a direct quote, so you're going to have to pardon the grammar problems. Okay, so this is from the official transcript, and they actually use those underlines that are up there. Excuse me, what happened to it?
Fred, your slides are...
Whoa, what did I do? I don't know what I did. Oh, okay. So the underlines that are there are in the official transcript. I think the person who's writing this puts those in when they really don't know what's happening in the sentence, okay? At first, I thought we could deal with this. Deal with the problem one issue at a time. We made the decision on Fannie and Freddie because there was systemic risk to our mortgage markets. And then obviously AIG came along. That was that big insurance company that was heavy into the credit default swaps. And Lehman came along, and it declared bankruptcy. Then AIG came along, and the house of cards, was much bigger, started to stretch beyond just Wall Street in the sense of the effects of failure. And so when one card started to go down, we were worried about the whole deck going down. Okay, I'd say, reasonably articulate, but he got the idea. This is a deck of cards which was created by the financial system. And why was it created? It was created because, to go back to the stagnation theory, if you will, because the real economy couldn't provide the accumulation of money, of capital that people wanted, the outlets for their investment. They had no place to invest their money in the real economy to make money, and so they helped to create and convince Congress to create this whole system. Okay, well, there were a bunch of numbers there, and those are all available if anybody wants them. And we'll probably put them up on the website, the Miller website. I'd like to turn this over to Bill to talk about the crisis as it has hit. Bill Tabb.
Thank you so much, Fred. I'm going to go over some of the same material Fred did, because it's a lot to take in, but in the context of what's been happening in recent months. But first, I want to say that, like many people who don't live around here, and maybe some people who do, I had not heard of Will Miller. And so on being invited to be part of the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series, I went to the organization's website to find out who this guy was and more about it. And the connection to social, ecological, and political concerns we're familiar with that. I mean, these days, you don't find a college where young people aren't concerned, at least a large number of them, with social, ecological, and political justice. But also on the website, implications of capitalism and imperialism. And that you don't hear in many classes in universities. We live in a capitalist society, but we don't talk about it as a capitalist society or an imperialist society and form of organization. And that's important to do because it changes the way we talk about things. This topic, the current financial crisis, described as a crisis of capitalism, is a way a lot of the most conservative people in America are thinking about what's going on. That Mr. Greenspan, who was head of the Federal Reserve, our central bank, Fred read you his quote, is shocked that this was going on because he believed that free markets always work well and that government should get out of the way of the market and allow it to work. However, when a crisis happens, government must step in, because if government does not step in, it spirals down and down and down until it just keeps going. And it spirals down for reasons I'll talk about, and it is why government always intervenes in a crisis. And the extent to which the crisis is made less worse, if I may use a Bush expression, less worse depends on how well the government acts in that crisis. Now, this brings us to socialism, as Representative Jeb Hensarling, I apologize to the congressman if that's not the way he says his name. He's a conservative from Texas, and he told his fellow representatives that this is no time to abandon free market principles. He says, how can we have capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down? And the answer is pretty simple. We always have socialism when capitalism gets in trouble. And what it does first is to bail out capitalists. It does not talk about the people who are losing their homes, how to keep people in their homes, people who are losing their jobs, that they need jobs or health care or anything else. And so the idea that George W. Bush and Ben Bernanke, who now has Greenspan's job as head of the Fed, are somehow socialists is a very strange understanding of what socialism is. But what I want to do is talk about how we got here and the changes in the economy, some of which Fred has pointed to. And I want to underline a few of them and then talk about how the crisis has evolved. First is this business of debt, of the financial sector, which in 1980, the financial sector was about 20% of the economy. My dates are a little different than Fred's, but the financial sector went from 10, 15, by 1980 it was 20% of the economy. Now, in 2007, the liabilities, the amount that the financial sector owed, was equal to 116% of the gross domestic product, of all goods and services produced. That is, the financial sector owes more than everything we produced last year. They owed it. Now, who'd they borrow it from? Well, partly they borrowed it from each other, and it's the interdependence of the banks, the insurance companies, that created and deepened the problem we have. And it's why, a little later, I'll talk about Secretary of the Treasury Paulson and his rescue efforts. It's the reason he's having so much trouble. He doesn't know which part of this Wall Street complex to rescue first. And so he works on one, like the Dutch little boy putting his finger in the dike, and then there's another hole here and another hole there. It's because of this interdependence. And I want to explain how the crisis came out of this interdependence. Let's go back to 2000. In 2000, 2001, the stock market collapsed, went into a very serious decline. And the reason it did that was in the late 90s, we had what was called the new economy. People discovered the internet and came to believe, investors came to believe, that anything that was being sold on the internet, any company selling dog food or diapers or anything else, as long as it did it on the internet, it was worth more than any company that had stores and so on. And there was this period when stocks just went out of sight, and then people saw these companies weren't making any money, that most of them were losing money, and it collapsed. Well, that was a bubble. A bubble is when, the economy goes up based on something that can't continue, and then it collapses. When it collapses, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, lowers interest rates. The reason it lowers interest rates is when you want to go buy a car, the price of the car is important, but much more important is how much each month you have to pay the bank to keep the car, right? And if you buy a house, the price of the house is important, but what the family really is concerned about is every month, how much have we got to get together to pay the mortgage? So when interest rates are low, it's easier to buy these big ticket items, especially homes. And home sales started to go up. And home sales increased, housing prices increased, and as they shot up, more people decided they better buy a home before they just got too expensive and they couldn't afford it, and they went to take out mortgages. Now, in the old days, before roughly 1980, as Fred showed you how financialization has grown, in the old days, roughly before 1980, when you took out a mortgage, you went to your bank, you sat down with your banker, he looked at your pay, your assets, and whether you'd be able to pay back the mortgage. And then this mortgage originator, he or she would ask you some questions, and then if they decided you were a safe risk, they'd give you a mortgage. The bank would hold that mortgage for 20 or 30 years, and every month you'd pay your mortgage until finally you'd own your home, and that was how it worked. That's not how it works anymore, because in this era of financialization, what the bank does, and it's not just the bank, but a whole bunch of state-chartered mortgage originators who give you mortgages, they would give you the mortgage, and then they would sell your mortgage to somebody else. What they would do is sell, if they're not a big bank, they'd sell it to a big bank. Big bank would put together 10 million worth of mortgages and sell them in a collateralized debt obligation, the CDOs that Fred had up there. And when they sold it, they wouldn't get the 10 million, but they'd get maybe 9 million now, and then the people who bought it would get the income over the 20, 30 years, so the investor would get return on their money. The bank would get the money now, which would enable them to give out more mortgages. Then they'd securitize those, sell them off. This way, And the good part was more people could get mortgages because the banks kept having more money to lend out since they didn't keep any of it themselves. But since they didn't keep any of it themselves, they didn't really have an incentive to ask too many hard questions. As a matter of fact, the folks originating the loans were happy to give what were called ninja loans. Now, some of you think you know what a ninja is, but it means no income, no job, or assets, N-I-N-G. And a ninja loan was given to people who had no prospect of paying back the loan, but they didn't really care because they're going to sell it on in these collateralized debt obligations. Then the investment banks on Wall Street got into the game, and what they did was they took these securitized mortgages and they broke them up into what are called tranches or groups, depending on how risky the loan is. This way, if you're an investor who doesn't want to take very much of a risk, you take the safest mortgages, and if you're an investor who's willing to take more risk, you take the riskier mortgages. And of course, if you take the riskier ones, you get a higher return. If you take the safer ones, you get a lower return, but supposedly they're safe. So this made it easier to sell these collateralized debt obligations, sliced and diced, and some of them are very complicated. They had 100 different categories of mortgages. And they did that not just with mortgages, but with credit card receivables. So that if you're a big department store and you need money for the winter season's fashions, you sell your credit card receivables. That is the money that people using your credit card are going to pay over the next 2 years, the money they owe you. Sell it to somebody who'll get the income over the 2 years. You get the money now, and you can buy the new fashion, whatever. If you're a government, you can sell your tax receivables, the property tax that's going to come in next January, and get the money now, or not quite all the money because they've got to get a profit, and so on. So these debt instruments have become dominant, and Fred showed you some of the numbers. They're far bigger than the real economy. And it works pretty well if everybody pays off, and in housing, if housing prices keep going up. But if housing prices go down and people don't pay those mortgages, all these collateralized debt obligations are in trouble. More than that, if you thought there might be a difficulty, you could buy insurance. And the insurance the investor bought is called a credit default swap. And Fred had the credit default swaps, which are now, there's something like $62 trillion of them out there. Now, the whole American economy is about 13 trillion. So 62 trillion is pretty big. What are these things called credit default swaps? Well, they're really an insurance policy. Someone sells you a guarantee that if something goes bankrupt or some bond doesn't pay, they will pay you a certain amount. But it's not called insurance. And this is important. The reason it's called a swap and has this really funny name, strange name, credit default swaps, which makes no sense to most of us, is because if it was called insurance, it would be regulated. Because in our country, having gone through the Great Depression, when homeowners lost their homes because the insurance policies they'd taken out suddenly weren't worth anything, the Congress and the President decided these insurance companies have got to act responsibly. They can't sell you insurance and then when you need to collect, they don't give you the money. That's dishonest and we won't allow it. So if it's called insurance, it's regulated. And the insurance company has to put capital aside so there's money if they have to pay off the insurance. But if you call it a swap, it's not regulated. And you don't have to have any capital. You don't have to tell anybody what you're doing. We don't even know for sure that there is $62 trillion worth of these things out there because they don't have to report it anywhere. It's not registered anywhere. That's an estimate from the financial sector. Further, you don't actually have to own the bond to take out insurance on it. As Fred pointed out, just as a gambler, you can say, you think General Motors is going to go bankrupt. So what you're doing is buying a financial instrument that if General Motors does go bankrupt, promises to pay you some huge amount of money, and you pay a small premium to buy the right to collect all that money. However, if the company you bought it from, and AIG, the American Insurance Group, AIG a short while ago was the largest insurance company in the world. Many people have their home insurance, their life insurance. My private jet is insured by AIG. There are a lot of things they do. They had a small office in London, about 370 people, and those guys started selling insurance, and they sold it with the understanding they'd never have to pay it off. There would never be a problem. So they're collecting the premiums knowing that the mortgages, the subprime loans, all this other stuff would be just fine, until it wasn't. And when it wasn't, AIG basically was bankrupt. And so the first thing the government did was give them 86 billion of your dollars. That wasn't enough, so they gave them another 36 billion of your dollars. Can you imagine what you could do with that kind of money in terms of scholarships for college kids, health care, retirement, daycare? I mean, you're talking about huge sums, and this brings us to what happens when companies like Bear Stearns, one of the big 5 investment banks, goes bust, or Lehman Brothers goes bust. The Secretary of the Treasury said, we have to save Wall Street. We have to save the banks. And this led to what was called the Paulson Plan. Now, my man John McCain, and I know I shouldn't electioneer here, and I know you're all commie pinkos and won't vote for John, but he went down to Washington to save the economy and get everybody together and get him to endorse the Paulson Plan. John didn't know what the Paulson Plan was, but he was sure it was good. It was a long and complicated plan. It was 2.5 pages long. Seriously, that's all it was. And McCain didn't have time to read it, but he did go to, he stopped his campaign, went down to Washington to delay things there. In any event, what Paulson asked for was the power to take 700 billion of your dollars and do whatever he thought was best with it without any oversight by anybody, and a legal mandate that no court in America could review what he did with the money. Well, Congress began getting phone calls and letters saying Americans thought this was just not a really great idea to give this guy that kind of money without knowing what he was going to do with it. So he told Congress what he would do with it. He would buy the most toxic CDOs and other financial instruments to help Wall Street out of this difficult position. Now, this was a really dumb thing to propose doing. Economists, whether they were right-wing economists, left-wing economists, centrist economists, said, look, you have tens of trillions of these things out there, and we don't know what they're worth, because the CDO, when you buy it, you get 200 pages that explains what's in it, all written in impenetrable prose so that nobody, even the people who write them, know what's there. A person's mortgage could be divided among 100, 1,000 different people holding that mortgage. They may live in Abu Dhabi or in Denmark, who knows. So what you have to do is help the banks so that they can make loans to real businesses, roll over debt, write down the mortgages and so on to get some kind of resolution to this. Finally, the British did that. They nationalized their banks. And when they nationalized their banks, they bought stock in them, and as controlling owners of the banks, they told the banks, you must use the money we're giving you to give loans to businesses so they can make payroll, so the economy can function smoothly, and we get out of this frozen credit situation we're in. You cannot use the money to pay dividends to stockholders and limits on how much the top executives of the banks could take of the money and so on. Because if you don't do that, and we're not doing that, Mr. Paulson's second plan, he said, we don't believe in punishment. We're not going to punish the banks. So in theory, if the banks want to, they could take the money they've now been given and declare dividends and give it to the stockholders of banks that basically should be out of business. Now, it's hard to believe that this kind of stuff goes on. It's hard to believe, first, that the amount of gambling, that these financial instruments, that giving guarantees that you can't possibly back up, giving loans to people who can't pay back the money, this is a funny kind of capitalism. But it is, in fact, what has happened over the last 5 or 6 years, where the financial sector has grown, and you saw Fred's graph there, 40% of the profits of all corporations in America go to the financial sector for doing this stuff. And this is how they make their money. So there are other parts of it, and I'll talk about a couple of the parts, and then I want to talk more about how it's being dealt with. And then what I think is really pretty bad news, in the sense that I believe it will get deeper and it will go on for quite a while. And I'll explain why I think that, and then talk about some of the things that might be done. The banks are regulated. Now, it's true, since Ronald Reagan, a lot of the regulation isn't enforced. A lot of the regulation has been taken away to allow them to do things. But still, the banks have to keep capital. They have to keep reserves in the possibility of bad loans. If they lend money, the money doesn't come back, they need reserves to cover that. Banks that have to keep capital against loss don't make money with that capital. It has to be there to protect against bad loans. So what they've done is they've set up SIVs, S-I-V, special investment vehicles, structured investment vehicles, that are independent, and they sell these collateralized debt obligations to these new vehicles they set up, because the vehicles aren't regulated. That's why they set them up. And so we have a shadow financial system. Fred was talking about, economists talk about the real economy that produces goods and services, and he said humorously, what's the other, an unreal? Yes, it is an unreal, because the shadow financial system, which is now bigger than the regular financial system, has no rules, no regulation. They don't have to report to anybody. They can do whatever they want, and they have gotten our country into this kind of mess. And it's a mess that has spread around the world. So how you get out of this has got to be pulling back the shadow banking system, putting it into the light, and regulating it. And as soon as you regulate it and put protections in, it can't exist anymore, because it can only exist under the terms that have gotten us in this trouble. But it has to be done. And this is what Mr. Paulson doesn't want to do. He was the head of Goldman Sachs. He comes from Wall Street. His whole apparatus, his whole way of thinking is how to keep this game going. But if this game keeps going, the rest of us pay for it and don't get any benefit out of it. And so that must happen. And that's going to be very hard politically, because the things that Fred and I have been explaining to you, and I hope we've given you some sense of it, are just so enormous and so costly, and the amount of money being thrown at them is so huge and still won't solve the problem, that the rest of the economy, the rising unemployment, the people losing homes, something like 1 million people have already lost their homes, another 1.5 million, perhaps 2 million, will lose their homes in 2009. These are real families where they will have no place to go. They're going to have to, relatives, whatever, find some place they can rent if they can find something, but lose their neighborhood, their school, and so on. An incredible dislocation for millions of people. The consumers can't solve it because consumer debt, as you saw, has grown enormously. Americans' credit card debt, student debt, I probably don't have to tell you folks too much about that, many of you. This is money that, as you go out into the job market and the jobs don't pay enough to pay off the debt, creates defaults there. All right, so what happens? What happens for older people is their retirement, which is in the stock market, either directly they own stock or their retirement funds put the money in the stock market as a way to have it go up so you can pay them in their retirement. Stock market in the last year has gone down 44%, which is to say, on average, anybody who had their money, their retirement in the stock market, their retirement is now 44% less than it was a year ago. That is going to affect decisions for a lot of people. It also affects the rest of the world, because as our economy went into this, other economies followed, and some did much worse than we did. Iceland, the banks in Iceland basically had 9 times the amount of the whole output, the whole income of Iceland in overseas assets, which they bought, owed money on, couldn't pay. Basically, Iceland, the whole country, is totally bankrupt at this point, and it's a question of who will bail them out, because they followed the same kind of techniques. In Eastern Europe, in Hungary, the Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, every place from Brazil to Bulgaria, you have very serious financial problems, which are, in a sense, worse than ours. And they're worse because of the interdependence of the financial system, that many countries produce commodities. They produce copper, they produce tin, whatever. Now, those commodity prices were going up. The stuff was being sent to China. China was producing goods and things, sending them to us. We would buy the Chinese stuff. They would take the money, lend it back to the United States. We then could buy more stuff from China. For a while, it worked really nicely, right? We got to live beyond our means by borrowed money. Our government borrowed money, individuals, business, everybody borrowed money. And the Chinese got employment because they got to factories to produce all this stuff. I mean, the poison milk and the pet food, not so good, but the plastic toys and Americans. All right. So the commodities went to China. China produced the stuff. They sold it to us. We paid them money. They lent us back the money. And this has gone round. But the debt level increased. When it stops, and it's now stopping because Americans can't afford to import as much, it affects the commodity producers. It affects everybody producing oil, because as the economy slows down, one of the good things about this is oil has dropped quite considerably because the economic activity is slowed. People are driving less, they can't afford to, even as oil prices come down and so on. Many of these countries were growing because they were borrowing money, and now the people who lent them the money need the money back. And so their currency values are going down as people pull money out of these countries. So you're seeing currencies fall very dramatically. Fred mentioned the carry trade, and I know we're doing a lot of economics tonight, but it's important. The carry trade, and Japan was the key country in this. Japan had a recession that went on for 10 years because their financial sector blew up, basically. Their real estate was far worse than ours. The Emperor's Palace in downtown Tokyo sits on a few acres. The Emperor's Palace, at the height of their real estate bubble, that land was worth more than all the land in California, if you can picture that, on paper. And so when that crashed down, the Japanese economy stayed down for about 10 years and only began to recover when China started buying stuff from Japan. When it collapsed, the Japanese government lowered their interest rates to 0. So smart people on Wall Street borrowed money in Japan at 0 interest, invested it in Brazil and got a high return, and then paid back the money to Japan and made a lot of money. That's the carry trade. You borrow one place, you invest it somewhere else, and then you return. Well, what's happened to Japan is the carry trade has collapsed, and everybody needs to buy Japanese yen to pay back the money they owed because the game is up. And the value of the Japanese yen as a result is going up. Now, when the value of your currency goes up, it means foreigners buying your products have to pay a lot more. So Japan, this great export engine, can't export. Their stuff's too expensive. So the Japanese are in trouble. In this way, the crisis moves around the world to different countries for different reasons because of this interdependence. And so we're faced with a situation where it's not just us, it is really global. It's in Europe, it's in Germany, it's in England, Russia's in very bad shape, and so on, because of the international connections and because the American financial model was copied by other countries which used a lot of debt to buy up assets and now can't pay back the debt. So it's very serious, and it will last a while, and it will require international coordination, and it will increasingly affect the rest of us who didn't gamble, who don't have big investments anywhere, but are going to find the demand for our services, many of us, are not there. Students graduating looking for jobs are going to have a hard time. Certainly all those MBA students who thought they were going to Wall Street has been laying off, tens and tens of thousands of workers. They're not hiring. So it is very serious, and it will stay serious. I think, and again, I cannot read the future any better than anybody else. The newspapers are very fearful about panicking people. You see bad news, but we speak of a recession, a slowdown, increase in unemployment from 6% maybe to 7%, 8%. But it could in fact be worse. The new president is going to face this, and it is going to be a very deep challenge to them. I think what will have to happen is, first, the homeowners, the people who are being thrown out of their homes, will have to be helped. And they'll have to be helped, and there are different ways of doing this. Technically, the solutions are there for a lot of it, and that's the good news. With the people losing their homes, and I'll just run through some of this and then finish up and take questions and discussion. But the people losing their homes, you can solve that any number of ways. One is to have judges renegotiate their mortgages. So if they bought a house and paid $500,000 for it, but the house is worth $300,000 now, and they owe $400,000 on the house, the bank loses half the value of the house if they foreclose. It's expensive to foreclose, and then nobody wants to buy it when they try and sell it. So it's much better for the people who hold the mortgage, much better for the family, much better for the economy, if they write down the mortgage to the realistic value of the house and let the people pay on what it's worth now. Another way to do it is to let people live in their homes and pay rent, whatever the going rent is on similar houses, instead of having to pay this huge mortgage which they can't pay, and let them live in it, rent it for 5 years, and at that point negotiate either a sale or they move on, whatever. But you don't dislocate so many millions of people. Because if you do, in communities where a house on either side of you is vacant and is going to be vandalized and isn't paying taxes to the local government, there go your services, there goes the value of your house, and it spreads and accumulates. So they must do that first. And that's what Paulson should have done. His first thing should have been not to save the people who caused the problem, but to save the people who've been victimized by it. In terms of state and local governments, the money that the federal government is spending should be going to state and local governments so they don't have to lay off teachers and librarians and shut down services. That's what needs to be done, not saving the people who created these vehicles. They should lose their money. The stockholders in these companies should lose it. If you believe in capitalism, you win some, you lose some. Well, you lost big, that's it. But the people who were not gambling should not be bearing the burden. And I think that's the general outline of the way people have got to start making demands on the government, on the new president, whoever that person is. If it's Obama, his advisors are the old Clinton advisors, and they are not prepared to do anything too radical. They come from Wall Street also. They're more sensible, I think. Mr. McCain's chief advisor is Phil Gramm. Phil Gramm is no longer his official advisor because he said Americans are a bunch of whiners and complainers, and he should get over it and just sort of accept what's happening. That did not go well with people. He was scheduled to be the Secretary of the Treasury if Mr. McCain had won. He's the one who deregulated the banks. As senator, he was head of the Senate Banking Committee and arranged for all of this. His wife was on the board of Enron. Before that, she was on the Commodity Commission that supposedly was regulating Enron. It's all very close, and you really don't want that in the way your government is run. But even if you have Obama come in, the lack of vision, and there will be an effort to protect the people and to restore what really can't be restored instead of doing what needs doing. But that's like Franklin Roosevelt. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected in the Great Depression, he was elected on a campaign to balance the budget. That's what he ran on. But he learned that that was an impossible and wrong-headed thing, and that he had to create jobs for people and do the other New Deal, had to regulate companies and so on. I think Obama is a very smart guy, and I think he will learn that, but it will depend on whether there's a movement pushing him from the outside and insisting that the needs of ordinary people come before the needs of Wall Street. So I'll end on that and take questions, disagreements, comments from people. The floor is open. Yeah. You have to talk really loud in here.
Two questions. One, Warren Buffett had plenty of choices of who to bail out. Why did he choose Goldman Sachs? Two, why was the second bailout passed so quickly when it wasn't much better than the first one? And our own Congressman Peter Welch said, I remember hearing it in the morning, he said, well, I reluctantly passed it. Well, he passed it. Why pass it reluctantly? Why didn't people reject it as they rejected the first one? Aside from the answer that there was an urgency to do something, what else was behind passing the second bailout when it wasn't much better than the first?
Yeah, the two questions. One was on why Warren Buffett, the richest man in America, I guess, and a very shrewd investor, he invested in two companies with a lot of money, Goldman Sachs and General Electric. And he did that because, first of all, he got a fabulous deal from both of them. He got a better deal than any other investor would have gotten, because what they got was not only his money, but his imprimatur of this is a company worth investing in. And that was worth more to Goldman Sachs and GE than even his money was, because given his prestige as an investor, if he said these are good companies, it was worth a lot to the companies. And they gave him an incredible deal, basically guaranteed profit over the next 10 years, which no other investor would have gotten. Also, Goldman Sachs is probably the smartest firm on Wall Street. It's not just that many secretaries of the Treasury come from Goldman Sachs. Mr. Paulson used to be head of Goldman Sachs. If you're a Democrat, you get Robert Rubin, former head of Goldman Sachs. John Corzine, former head of, they're all over. They're very smart guys, and so on. So Goldman Sachs, to show how smart they are, they saw the subprime crisis coming, and they sold all of their collateralized debt obligations, while companies like Bear Stearns, another investment bank, and Lehman Brothers continued to buy them. So Goldman saw the collapse coming. That didn't mean they didn't continue to sell collateralized debt obligations to schnooks who'd buy them. They did. They made a bundle of money continuing to sell stuff they knew was no good, but they didn't hold it themselves. Very smart guys. That's the Warren Buffett thing. Now, on the bailout, there had to be a bailout because the financial sector works on confidence, works on trust. And when there's no trust, the only body that can restore trust is the government. And so the government always is going to every financial crisis there have been in our history. There have been 92 of these crises since 1980. Countries like Sweden have had the same thing happen. Argentina 3 times by now. It's because when you deregulate finance, as they did, you get the crisis, then government has to come in, fix it up. So it's a question of how government does it. And Paulson's original plan and what he's doing now is just not very smart. It's not because it's trying to restore what can't be restored and to give money to these people who caused the crisis, which is why everybody's mad at it. He should have done it differently. It should be done differently. But the Congress people, looking at this and with a gun being held to their head, said, if you don't vote for this not very good plan, it'll collapse. And so faced with that, and they're not economists, their staff has to, they have to know about Afghanistan and nuclear war and food crisis. They really didn't understand the stuff, and they were given no time to figure it out and just told vote. And so a lot of people who really didn't want to do it, given the choice of do it or not do it, as you say, reluctantly did it. And people are furious because they should have insisted on something better. They didn't. Yes, sir.
In your view, to what extent can these issues be solved within the framework of capitalism without, by means of regulations or New Deal, what are the another way to frame the question is, what are the possibilities, along with the necessity here, of transcending capitalism to a more genuine form of socialism for the rest of us?
Yeah, that question comes up a lot, and it even comes up in the McCain campaign. I should say, I really don't support John McCain. I have to say this, I gave a lecture on Sunday to a religious group and was going on about my man John, and at the end, people were really, some of them were really disappointed that I supported McCain. So in case anybody in here didn't catch the attempt at humor there, right? Now, this crisis will be much worse than the other recessions we've had since 1929. It will go on longer than any of the others we've had, and the damage it will do will be greater. I cannot say, and nobody can say for sure, how deep, how long, but I think pretty much all economists think it's going to be worse than anything we've seen in our lifetimes, except those folks who remember the Great Depression. Now, in the Great Depression, there was the possibility of socialism, and Roosevelt basically saved capitalism by putting the regulations in place, which they now have taken away, which means one reason it's such a bad situation. But it's bad at a really deep level. And if it continues, and if it becomes difficult to help ordinary people within the reforms and the redistribution that's possible under capitalism, who knows? But that will depend on how people react to what government does, how deep the crisis is, who gets bailed out. Because at this point, we have income inequality that's back to the level of 1929. We have moved back to that kind of robber baron of, rich and exploited everybody else, stagnant incomes for working people, our retirement taken away. These are very serious things. So that if it is prolonged, I think there will be serious questioning of the system we now live under, and there will be a very sharp division in America. With Joe the plumber and a lot of people voting for some war hero to be president and punish the socialists who are trying to get government control. And there'll be other people who say, in a democracy, government should work for the people, and it should do whatever is necessary. And if that means taking control of corporations and running them in a way that's good for other people and having workers participate in those decisions, so be it. It's better. And so the discussion, I think, is going to get really interesting if this is as deep and as prolonged as it's looking like it's going to be. Yes, back there.
I'm wondering, beyond the ideas about reforming the financial system you've mentioned, about some of your thoughts on the other systematic flaws of our current economic system. A couple of these that come immediately to mind are the fact that we have sort of an expectation of a 10% return on investment, which has created a series of economic bubbles in different sectors. The idea that we still are based on a debt-based system of money creation, and that if we rely on a growth of the physical economy, we have a series of limitations that are creating huge environmental and social externalities. So it seems like there's a number of other limitations that we haven't addressed at all.
Yeah, good. That 10% return is over. You know, if you can hold on to it and not have 10% down, you're doing well, which is why the smart money is buying government bonds rather than investing anywhere. And this is why recovery is hard. Recovery can't take place until investors think there's an opportunity to make a profit. And if they think it's going to continue to go down, they're not going to invest, and that in turn makes it worse. The needs we have now have to do with the environment, have to do with energy, have to do with infrastructure. And so that the way out of the problem we're in is to spend money on things that are going to make a difference and to restore growth based on what the real needs are. I take the environmental crisis very seriously. I take global warming very seriously. I think Al Gore, President Gore, was right that this is the issue of our time, and if it is not dealt with properly, the planet is going to be a very different and not as good place. And I think the amount of jobs and the amount of economic activity that needs to be created to do that, the changes in the way we live, the way we package things. You know, in Europe, the car makers have to take the cars back, break them down, and recycle everything. The packaging, the cardboard that stuff is sent in has to be taken back, recycled. The whole idea of living that way, the food crisis around the world, water, the wars of the next 20 years are not going to be about oil, they're going to be about water in many parts of the world, and so on. These are the real challenges. And so the economy has to be reoriented to put our efforts into the things that are needed, and in doing that, we will create the jobs and the economic activity we need. So that I think that kind of really deep transformation is both needed and also a solution to, and an alternative to, this financialization which has brought us to this really bad place we're in. So I guess that's what I'd say to that. Yes, sir. Yes, you.
All right, good. Kind of like tagging on to your question over there. Do you think the whole financial system was going to face this without credit default swaps? By that I mean 50% of the profits that an investment bank makes go to their employees. That said, the fees that they charge to investors, so every one of you who has a 401k, they add up exponentially over time. So if your 401k is managed at 1% a year, well, after 10 years, that's 10% of your money. That's whether or not they
Compounded.
Compounded, exactly. So after 30 years, that's 30%, whether you made money or not. Now, tagging on to your, as you were just saying, it's got to happen because the population is expanding so much. And everybody likes to say, oh, we don't want to be like Europe in the United States. But we will be because our population is growing. Europe hit the fan. You know, Europe hit the brakes about 200 years ago because there was less land and more people. Do you think that's what we're going to come to now?
I think a lot of I never know why this thing about we don't want to be like Europe. I'd really like single-payer health care. If that's socialist, that's fine with me. I'd really like it, you know. If recycling on a sensible basis, mass transit in big cities, you know, rebuilding the railroads, rebuilding the bridges, not the one to nowhere, but the one in Minnesota that collapsed. You know, the Society of Engineers, whatever the group is, said we need $2 trillion just to repair the infrastructure of all the things that are falling apart. I live in New York. The West Side Highway collapsed. I mean, it just fell down because it was built during the Great Depression. It was built by the Works Public Administration. They built the airports, they built the roads, and now they're all collapsing. So these things need doing, and you're quite right that Wall Street has made their money off of this stuff, and the rate of return the rest of us are getting is a small part compared to what they're getting. The other thing is 90% of the financial sector is owned by 10% of Americans, the richest 10%. So it's a major contributor to the upward redistribution. It's not just the guys on Wall Street who get bonuses, 10, 20, $30 million a year. The heads of the company get 50, 60 million a year. But it's a tremendous sucking of money out of the rest of us, redistributing it upward in that way, and changing the nature of our democracy. because it means that money gets Congress to rewrite the bankruptcy laws to make it harder for people who have a health emergency and have to declare bankruptcy. They can't anymore, right? Because the credit card companies have got them to
Part of the reason I think it grew so much over the past few years was because we started to put things more into the market. Whether, like your predecessor said before about collateralized debts, but also it was pension plans being put in, and everybody getting involved in, say, like the tech boom and such.
Yeah, the pension plans is a whole nother area. That the effort since Reagan and now Bush to privatize Social Security is a way to give Wall Street that pension money. And if they had done it a year ago, everybody's pension would be down 44%, right? So Social Security is basically all many retired people have. I don't have the numbers in my head, but a very large percent of retirees, all they've got is Social Security. And now a lot of other people can depend on Social Security more heavily. What companies are doing is they're selling their pension plans to Wall Street firms to invest. Now, while the company has a responsibility to their employees, the Wall Street firm, if they lose money, is just going to say sorry. And they're going to rack up their fees by buying and selling stock very rapidly, because what they care about is their fee income, not your retirement income. And so the things you're raising, I think, are just very important issues, and they come up in all of these areas. And it's got to stop. It really has to stop. Other questions or other people who want to object or raise a question? Yes, ma'am.
I have another question.
Sure.
I don't hear in the discussion anything about the huge military budget. When we spend over $500 billion on the military, plus wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, how do you think that affects this situation?
Yeah. The debt that the wars are adding, aside from, the tens of thousands of people, Iraqis, the millions who've been displaced, the American soldiers who've died, just the brutality of shock and awe as a way of spreading democracy. The financial cost is in the trillions of dollars. And it is a cost we will pay because we borrowed money to fight the wars. They didn't raise taxes, they cut taxes. So the wars have been financed with more borrowed money. And so we'll be paying interest on that forever. And that's money that does not go to health care, does not go to education, does not go into the kind of things we want. The thought that you'd have a war of choice to decide to attack Iraq for whatever reasons, and it certainly wasn't weapons of mass destruction. If Iraq produced kumquats or apples or something, I don't think we would have spread democracy there. But an economy that depends on oil leads you into all sorts of adventurous policies in areas that have oil. And its economic impacts are just devastating, as well as its human impacts. Yes, absolutely. And we should mention that. Yes, sir.
Just a footnote for the lady. If you add up not just the bombs, bullets, and bayonets, but you throw in the VA, you throw in military retirement, the global cost of American militarism, that budget is larger than the same budget for the entire rest of the world put together. So you're right in raising the question, do we need that much military?
Yeah. We're spending over half of all the military expenditures in the world. And while that does create profits for Halliburton and the defense contractors and so on, it does damage, and its opportunity cost is that it's money not spent on things we might much prefer. Yes, sir.
You started to address this, but I'd like to sort of return to it. It seems to me what happens, the impact of all this, it's not automatic, it's not predetermined. It really depends on what we do or don't do. A typical response, and we're already hearing that, is that we've all got to tighten our belts, we're all going to have to do it a little bit less, we don't want to rock the boat, let Governor Jim Douglas because he's a known quantity, and he'll continue to do what he's done in the past, that sort of stuff. And my reaction, and you may think this is voluntarist, but it's the notion that this is precisely the time to rock the boat, that if we don't, the result of this crisis however we get out of it, and capital will get out of it, whether it takes 2 years or 5 years, it'll be a permanent decline in living standards and the quality of our life. And we've got an opportunity now, because sort of the whole paradigm on which our economy has been based, everything we believe about the free market, is up for grabs. It's a teachable moment. We've got an opportunity to organize social movements that haven't been very strong in this country, and to fight for things like a massive public works program at union wages, which seems utopian right now, but I don't know that that will in 6 months.
Yeah, good. In the 1970s, when the New York fiscal crisis happened and the national economy was in bad shape, I interviewed a bunch of people who lived through the Great Depression to find out where those movements came from. The movements that pushed Roosevelt, that organized the unions, that took people's furniture when it was taken out of their homes by the sheriffs and put on the street, the people who went and carried the furniture back into people's homes and told the sheriff to get lost. That stuff happened in America, and people were very militant about it. And I wanted to say, well, how did it happen? And they said, well, it didn't just happen. A funny thing, for the first 2-3 years of the Depression, we were in shock. They just said, this is how it is. We have to live less and have less. But we got mad. That's what happened, but it took us a while. And I think we're in that, assuming this goes on, and I think it will, we're in that period where people have got to start thinking that they don't want to take it. Because if they accept it, they're going to have their living standards decline further, their real incomes and all that. Or they're going to make demands. They're going to go to Washington. They're going to ask these candidates to stop talking generalities and say, how are you going to really make a difference? And about this sheriff in Chicago who refuses, the guy refuses to carry out evictions because renters in Chicago, they don't own the house, but the person who owns it, the mortgage is in default, so the renters are being pushed out on the street. And this guy said, this is crazy. I am not going to enforce this law. This is a bad law. And he won't do it. And I think that kind of stuff has got to happen. My daughter, who almost got thrown out of the Obama campaign, she's in Pittsburgh, she was ready to go door to door on Saturday, and they had to tell her the Steelers were playing, and if she went and interrupted people watching the Steelers play football, she would get not votes for her candidate, but but she sent me this thing. There was a young college student who graduated college. The only job she could find was making telephone calls for those people, the businesses that sell you things or give you messages at campaign time. And she and the people in her office were given this stuff about Obama, sex education for children, and how he's a socialist and supports terrorism, and this whole list of scurrilous lies about Obama. She walked out, and 40 of her co-workers walked out with her, and they said, we just will not do it. And I think that, Al Gore recently called on people when they try and open new coal-fired plants and spew crap into the environment, shut them down. Go sit in, like the students did in the 60s, on discrimination. Sit in, stop it. And that until we're active, a lot of bad stuff's going to continue to happen. So I think it takes a while, but I think you're quite right that this is a teachable moment, that people are concerned, they want to know, and as they know, they get angry, they get active, and that's our job. Yeah, I fully agree. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I think it's really important how you started the discussion, both you and Fred, showing that this is primarily an economic crisis and not a financial crisis. That is, that capital did certain things through deregulation, through lowering interest rates in an attempt to spur growth and to prop up profits. And the post-war boom in the United States and elsewhere in many ways is a historical exception, that this is the normal way that capitalism operates, and the only way that it can solve its crisis now is to restructure and return to the conditions that will allow for more profits, and that means hitting wages, that means devaluing assets. That means that General Motors might have to disappear or consolidate with another motor company, with another auto company, because there's too much productive capacity for profitable investment.
Yeah.
And that, of course, comes back to the bigger question of this is what capitalism does, and we're getting a real historical sense of it right now. And that's why we need a different kind of system that's based on needs and planning. And then just the second point I want to make is the political situation that we face now. That it wasn't just McCain who went to Washington, it was Obama who went to Washington and pushed through the $700 billion bailout also. Like kind of the role that Roosevelt held during the Depression, that primarily his role is to defend the interests of the people who are in control of things, and that's what the bailout was. That's why it's so important to fight for expanding Social Security, for the right to renegotiate mortgages, for health care. And during the Depression, that was done by movements on the left, not in the Democratic Party. So it was the Socialist and Mass Communist Party that led the unions, that gave political leadership to the social struggle, that forced the reforms that benefited workers and ordinary people.
Thank you. We should finish up, but if there's anybody whose hand was up and I didn't see, we could take another question if that person is out there. Yes, sir. Is that you? One hand? Yes.
The stock market just went up 900 points today. That's 10%. How do you explain that?
Oh, I think it's going to be going up and going down like a yo-yo for a while. The question, everybody's waiting to call the bottom. And as soon as people think the bottom's there, it goes up until something else happens, and then it goes down. If it's really the bottom, then we'll get recovery. But what we'll see, there's a volatility index, and that volatility index is going crazy. A little bit of good news, and people think that that's it, but then you get some bad news. So it'll go up and down for a while. I think that's right. If you're brave enough to think you can call it, put your money in, but otherwise, hold on. Okay, thank you all very much.
Just before people leave, we did say at the beginning that if there were groups here that wanted to make announcements about activities that their organizations are carrying out in the struggle, and as came up tonight, we're going to need a lot more of the struggle going on. This is the time to make them. One here and then one over there.
And if you can come up and use the mic, that'd be great. That way everybody can hear your announcement. I work with Global Justice Ecology Project, and as Bill was talking about this need to mobilize around climate change obviously being very deeply connected to the economic crisis, the ecological crisis, the food crisis, and so on, there is a major mobilization being planned for the end of 2009, around the 2009 UN Climate Convention. We're hoping for millions of people participating in countries all over the world, but especially right here in the United States because of the key role the U.S. plays in the climate crisis, being the leading per capita emitter of carbon, as well as being the leading obstructor of international negotiations on the climate. So people who want to get involved in that, please pick up one of these funny-shaped yellow pieces of paper on the table as you head out the door on your left. It has information about getting involved in this major mobilization around the climate. Thank you.
I just want to let everyone know, this Saturday, November 1st, there's going to be a rally and protest in Montpelier talking about Vermont's opportunity to be building a peace economy versus an economy that's subsisting on corporations like General Dynamics and other war profiteering that exists in Vermont, and also talking about the tax breaks they get from our state legislatures and how they are involved in our communities. And so that's November 1st, this Saturday, 2 p.m., I think. 1:30, State House lawn. It's going to be a really great opportunity to network and learn about how war profiteering and our economy can work differently. You get the point, I think. It's a good action to come to.
No speech, no applause. Veterans get a sort of special credibility in the society. Those of us in a couple of groups like Vets for Peace, Iraq Vets Against the War, Vietnam Vets Against the War, we use that credibility to get through to people. If you're here and you're a veteran, there's a few of us down here. We would love to talk to you. If you're not a veteran and you can possibly get one or a panel of us or whatever, or debate, get us in your schools, get us in your churches, get us in your, your Lions Club, whatever. We want to talk to people, and we've pretty well got our stuff together as far as facts, data, and we can run from the technical to the purely emotional. We can talk about war crimes, we can talk about economics.
My name's Michael with the International Socialist Organization here on campus. The ISO is doing its annual Northeast Socialist Conference in New York City on November 15th and 16th. You can see the flyers on the table in the back. The word socialism is being thrown around quite a lot in the last month. And I think what people are getting at tonight is, like, what is the political alternative to the financial crisis? I was reading an article by Chris Hodges, I think, in Truth Dig, that was talking about the rise of populism and how both the right wing and the left wing are going to see a rise in terms of there's going to be, a split out there. And our job is to build that left wing as quickly as possible. I think, as Travis was talking about, it's the time to rock the boat. And I think the thing that we need to answer is, what is socialism, and is socialism possible in the United States? So the conference is going to be 2 days of taking up questions like that. There's going to be over 30 workshops, lots of great speakers, some of the things that people are bringing up, like the Communist Party in Harlem in the 1930s, talking about climate change, what's going on in Latin America, and certainly about the financial crisis. So if people want to check out the information on the flyer, we're going to organize carpools and things like that. Talk to me or talk to anybody in the back.